I think there are two or three important points. First of all, as you mentioned, there is huge differentiation taking place between the countries which are undergoing reforms and the countries which are not reforming. Countries undergoing reforms, of course, India, but Mexico, Indonesia, the Philippines, Korea, Kenya. With respect to countries which are not undergoing reform and which are going down the drain, if I may put it that way, the best example is Brazil. Now, China, interestingly enough, is undergoing a lot of reforms, not to increase growth, as the countries I mentioned, not to pull back, but to create a situation where growth becomes solid, sustainable, efficient, and balanced. And so we have these differentiations. This is point number one. Point number two, which is very important, which is that we get a lot of distorted vision because you look at equities or you look at stock markets and you say, oh, the emerging markets are performing badly. This is not true. What is happening is that these stock markets in emerging markets are, first of all, not as liquid as they should be. And so the amplitude of up and downs is felt much more strongly. In addition to that, these stock markets in emerging markets are dominated by foreign investors. These foreign investors don't have the same calculation, the same criteria, the same consideration than domestic investors. And so their reaction not necessarily reflect what is really happening on the ground. And what is happening on the ground gives very good foundations for looking at the future with a lot of confidence.
I'm going to ask you about the bets that you're placing for the next year. But before I do that, give us a sense on how you're viewing the world economy. I mean, particularly the developed countries, North America, Europe, and obviously some parts things are not so good. And the juxtaposition of those, the large economies and the developed economies with or versus some of the examples that you've just taken.
Yes, if you look at the world economy, the mature economies, the US is supposed to grow at about 2.7% this year. What is interesting is that wages are not increasing. And this is strange in a situation where supposedly we are in a full employment situation. Wages are not increasing because the statistics don't reveal the fact that a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, which went out of the statistics, out of the job market, are now starting to re-enter the job market. And so wages will not increase for quite some time, which is a very good news, in fact, with respect to the recovery. But what is interesting is that this recovery is 2.7%. And so you have to wonder if the theory of Larry Summers about secular stagnation doesn't have some truth in it. Now, when you look at Europe, in the best case, Europe will grow at about 1.5% this year. When you know that the greatest part of this growth will come and will be in Germany, it tells you how weak or even really non-existent growth will be in the Eurozone. And it shows how the situation of the stagnation of the economy, the recession because of the bad policies which have been pursued, will continue to hamper Europe. Right. Now, Japan, Abenomics is doing very well. The Abenomics policies are doing well, but it will take time. And so what we have today, at best, is between 0.6 and 1% of growth for Japan, which is good because things will improve. But the key message is that at the same time, on average, the new growth countries will represent 5% of growth this year. And so you can see that even if there is a slowdown, even if there are headwinds, the center of gravity of the global economy continues shifting toward the south and the east.
And the growth net countries. So within the growth net, are you placing any bets as to what could be the sort of gems in the coming year? Which is not to say the others are not gems, but they may not be shining today.
Yes, I take your point. I do believe that, as I mentioned before, if there is a time to be optimistic and hopeful about India, it is now. And so I am placing my bets on India. For the moment, we have something which sounds good, which looks good, and so what we need to see and how it will materialize in additional growth, in a growth momentum. So I think I am hopeful and confident because I think now this country has a true leader in Mr. Modi. I do believe that despite the political crisis in a country like Mexico, I think we will see a growth momentum because a number of reforms will continue to bear fruit, and the recovery in the US will have an impact. I do believe that Colombia and Peru are on a very good track for good growth. If you look at Africa, I believe that Kenya, Ethiopia are really good bets. Rwanda is doing well, but it is a very small country. But when you take Ethiopia and a country like Kenya, you have much more significant economies. I think Nigeria, there are some good surge of growth, but the political issues, the corruption, the security issues will hamper that. But nevertheless, I think we see some good push toward growth.
Right. So last question, what's the one thing that sort of keeps you worried at night, and what's the one thing that in some ways gives you optimism about the future?
What keeps me worried at night is that in many of these emerging countries, the new growth countries, we need to make sure that the politics doesn't get in the way of growth.
And reform, as you mentioned.
And reform. Because having a political debate is good, is sound, is useful. But sometimes the political debate turns into the, I would say, the conflict of personal and vested interest. And so I think whatever the merits of democracy, at some stage the debate has to stop. And action has to take place, and this action should not be hampered.
Okay.
So for me, this is really one major issue to make sure that reforms and growth and economic development orientation don't get distracted by false, distorted democracy.
Okay.
My reason of hope is that, first of all, with the surge of the middle class in all these countries and the new mindset that this middle class brings, the expectation toward better society, better governance, I think we see now that issues like corruption are everywhere at the forefront. What was taken as a kind of fatality, a fact of life, you cannot do anything about it, today is a matter of concern, and people are fighting against that. My second reason of hope, and it is linked to this first one, is now that the imperative of growth, the growth as an imperative, is becoming, I would say, the buzz, not only of the day, but is becoming part of a new mindset which is emerging. I think it is a great reason for hope.
Right. So an empowered citizenry and a desire to grow.
Exactly.
And with the growth net as it may be.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for your invitation.
Thank you.